What do you do if you're nostalgic for the Nintendo 64, but in the modern era, you're not sure where to begin? Maybe you found your childhood N64 in the attic and you went to plug it into your modern TV, but the hookups didn't work. Or maybe you went to go buy an adapter, but the image is super blurry and it doesn't look right. Maybe you went to buy some classic games for the Nintendo 64, but experienced sticker shock at the price of some of those games. Well, I've got great news for you. Today in 2025, there's lots of ways on modern consoles to play Nintendo 64 games, and I'm gonna run through all of them. And even though it's been almost 3 decades since the N64 came out, I wanna spend a little bit of time highlighting the one game that I think is the most timeless in the entire console library, and you can play it today, right now, without having to hook up the old console the way God intended. Now, while playing on an old CRT tube television with the original console, with the original games, with the original controller is usually the best way to experience the Nintendo 64 because that's the system and the technology around which it was developed for. I will say that there are some modern choices that you can make right now that are actually better for playing and experiencing those games than if you were to play them on the original console.
Sometimes I doubt your commitment to sparkle motion.
It's a lot better to play games at 60 frames per second than 3 frames per second. I'm looking at you, Turok 2. And 3. I'm gonna let other Mort continue in just a second, but in today's video, there's a ton of N64 games that are gonna be discussed, and you may be wanting to get some physical copies of video games, and that is where today's sponsor, Encore, comes in. Encore is a buy-sell app that's kind of like a mix between TikTok and eBay. Sellers such as myself post either buy it now or auction-based listings by posting video of the items in detail, so you can see exactly what you're getting. On other platforms, sometimes photos can be creatively taken in a way that hides important aspects of listings, or they might be stock photos or just photos from other listings that aren't from the one that you're actually buying. But on Encore, the item is shown and discussed on screen by the seller. Buyers can be confident knowing exactly what they're getting and that there are lots of deals to be had. Not to mention there's a lot of giveaways happening on Encore. I just gave away a collector's edition of a really expensive PlayStation Vita game, and there's more plans for giveaways to come. I've now been selling on Encore for a few weeks and I'm finding it to be a really fun platform. But the thing that I'm perhaps most impressed about with Encore is the way that they protect their community. Sellers are vetted in ways platforms don't typically do, and it means buyers can trust that they will have a safe and secure shopping experience online. Check out the link in the description below and make sure to come over to my profile and see the listings I have for sale right now. Happy hunting, and thanks to Encore for sponsoring today's video. And now, let's talk about the Nintendo 64. The first game that comes to mind when most people think of the Nintendo 64 is Super Mario 64. Back on the original N64, moving Mario in a fully 3D environment was mind-blowing. Since this game's release on the N64, there haven't been a lot of re-releases except for on the Wii Shop or the Wii U Shop. But the good news is that today, on the Nintendo Switch, you've got a couple of options, one of which is a little easier than the other. The first way to play Super Mario 64 on your Nintendo Switch is with a physical copy of the game Super Mario 3D All-Stars, which contains not only Super Mario 64, but Super Mario Sunshine and Super Mario Galaxy, all three of which are some of the best games ever made. Well, I mean, except Mario Sunshine has its share of detractors. But Mario Galaxy and Mario 64, come on. Now, the version that's on this pack utilizes emulation. However, it's still more than playable. Playing this on the original hardware really matters for hardcore gamers who love to do what's called speedrunning, which is where they play through the game as fast as possible, utilizing every shortcut and glitch, but this really only matters to some of the most hardcore of gamers. If you're just wanting to relive your past, this will work just fine. But there is a problem with the Mario 3D All-Stars pack. This was a time release that Nintendo stopped selling in stores and stopped allowing for downloads on their Nintendo Switch eShop. The only way now to play Mario 64 out of these 3 games is to use the Switch's online service. If you want to play the Nintendo 64 and you've got a Nintendo Switch, the Switch's online service is one of the best deals in gaming. There's a curated library of excellent games on the system, some of the most popular games like Zelda Ocarina of Time, all the way down to some of the more obscure ones like Iggy's Wreckin' Balls. It's a great option for playing the Nintendo 64 in the modern era, straight from Nintendo. However, if you're gonna play the Switch's online service, I do recommend one particular accessory. This is a Nintendo-made Nintendo 64 controller for your Nintendo Switch. It wirelessly connects to the Switch and is a great way to play all of the old classics. There's a lot of classic N64 games that I was playing where using the modern Switch Pro controller just didn't feel right. Instead, playing with the C buttons, the Z trigger, some of those things are just ingrained in my memory. I do think that if you're going to use the Nintendo Switch's online service, it's well worth your time to go to Nintendo.com and pay $50 to get one of these controllers for your collection. Be aware that a lot of people are selling these for a lot more than $50 on eBay and other resale markets, but you can get them in stock right now on Nintendo.com and pay the actual retail price. While most people think of Super Mario 64 first when they think of the Nintendo 64, the next one that they also probably think about is GoldenEye 007. And the good news here is there's a few options to play it. GoldenEye has a really interesting history when it comes to trying to make the game in the modern era. The first question is, who owns the right to the character of James Bond and the movie GoldenEye? Well, that starts with the movie studio MGM. The next is, who made the game? And that was Rare. At the time GoldenEye came out, Nintendo had a 49% ownership in the company Rare, which made them a second-party developer for Nintendo. However, in 2002, Rare was sold to Microsoft, and Rare became an exclusive developer for the Xbox. So when you have a major movie studio, Nintendo and Microsoft at the negotiating table, you can see why this became really complicated. Fans were not only clamoring to play the game, but they wanted to play an HD remaster, and Rare had developed a version of the game that was in HD, it was a remaster, however, it never officially came out. Today, if you want to play GoldenEye, there's two ways to play it. One is on the Xbox and the other is on the Nintendo Switch. Playing it on the Xbox is a lot of fun, but there are two problems that I had with it. Number one, there's no online multiplayer in that version of the game. You can only play local multiplayer. Secondly, the controller for that game never felt really comfortable or natural for me in playing the game. There are some control options that you can kind of mess around with and get it to kind of work, but it's not like an HD remaster where sometimes they'll go back and they'll remap the buttons, they'll make quality of life improvements, etc. It just sort of is like trying to fit the N64 into a modern Xbox controller. If you play it on the Nintendo Switch though, through their online service, you can play online multiplayer, and I think that the Nintendo 64's controller is really a fun way to play the game. I did try playing it on the Pro controller, but it never set in for me in a way where it felt fluid and fun. Now, people would say that GoldenEye is maybe one of the hardest games to go back through in the entire N64 library, and I wouldn't disagree. However, there is sort of a zen state that you can get into with the game, where once you sort of reacclimate back to how the controls worked back then, and you don't try to play the game like it's Call of Duty, but you play it like it's GoldenEye, it becomes really fun again, and for me, has been a blast to revisit on the Nintendo Switch. Just make sure you use an N64 controller, not a Pro controller. Now, while GoldenEye didn't get that HD remaster, there is a game that did, and that's the spiritual sequel, Perfect Dark. People call Perfect Dark a spiritual sequel to GoldenEye because it's basically the same gameplay, the same controls, except it's with Joanna Dark, it's not with James Bond, it's its own universe, it's its own thing, but even the sound effects and what you can do in the game feels a lot like James Bond, but many would say is arguably a better gameplay experience. While you can't play Perfect Dark on the Nintendo Switch, you can play it on the Xbox, and that's because Rare released a compilation of their games through a disc called Rare Replay. This compilation disc, Rare Replay, is one of the very best values in gaming. If you have an Xbox, it's a must get, either in physical form, or I believe you can download it for free if you have the online service. On this disc, you not only have the Perfect Dark HD remaster, but you have a bunch of other N64 games that have just a little bit of a shinier coat of paint and run just a little bit better than their N64 counterparts and make them arguably the definitive way to play most of those games. The HD version of Perfect Dark is on this compilation. It's not the N64 version with just a little bit better graphics. It's an actual HD remaster, and there's online multiplayer plus all the bot multiplayer that we loved playing in Perfect Dark. Rare Replay has 30 games on it, from the NES all the way up to the Xbox 360. However, Perfect Dark is not the only game on this compilation that has an HD remaster. The best game on the console is also here as well, and that's BanjoKazooie.
What'd you say?
Playing BanjoKazooie on Rare Replay feels like the best way to experience the game. It runs at 30 frames per second and in widescreen, and it looks great. Bonus, if you're playing on a Series X, it runs in 4K. The version on the Switch's online service, it runs at full frame, which means you'll have black bars on the side of the screen when you play the game. But maybe my favorite quality of life improvement to the version on the Xbox is what they did with the note system. If you recall, every level had a certain number of musical notes that you had to collect in order to complete the entire level. Unfortunately, if you died, all the notes would reset and you'd have to recollect them all from scratch, which could be totally frustrating. In the Xbox version, whatever you collect stays with you, and if you die, you don't lose everything that you've gained. You can keep exploring level until you find every last one of them. Now, the good news is you can hack this on the Nintendo Switch's online service through using save states, although some would say that you're not a real gamer if you use save states. But who cares whether you do the notes version on the Xbox or save states on the Switch's online service? The good news is you can play BanjoKazooie and BanjoTooie, the sequel, the follow-up to BanjoKazooie, right now today in the modern era on modern consoles without any worry about cables, wires, or anything that would disrupt your gameplay experience. Now, I've mostly focused on Xbox's Rare Replay compilation and Nintendo Switch's online service, but there's actually a third category of ways to play these games, and it's probably my favorite of all of them. And that's the remaster. And no one does it better than Night Dive Studios. Remasters run the full gamut, from being mediocre experiences, they're just the old games with maybe a slightly better frame rate and smoother graphics, to being made with love and care to present the games in the best possible way they could be presented. And Night Dive Studios seems to have aced this every step of the way. One of my favorite series on the Nintendo 64 is the Turok series, and Night Dive Studios has remastered all 3 mainline Turok games, with rumors of Rage Wars, the multiplayer-only shooter, still to come. The good news is about these games is that they run at 60 frames per second. There's quality of life improvements in terms of what they've done to save states, adding some maps or other things like that, where some of these games, like especially Turok 2, that becomes a giant maze, you can keep track of it a lot better. What's great about this is that it makes the games play better than they ever have, and you really feel that in the entire experience. Not only did Night Dive Studios remaster the Turok series, they also did Doom 64. The biggest complaint of that version of the game was that the screen was so dark that you basically had to bring your brightness all the way up, and even still, it was arguably a little bit dark. The remaster fixes all of that. The other big thing that remasters fix is the frame rate. Frame rate has to do with the fluidity of what you see on screen. If a game goes below 30 frames per second, it can become very difficult to play because it's very choppy, or it feels like you're playing single screen images at a time, and it almost feels like the game is breaking down on you. On the N64 version of Turok 2 and Turok 3, the frame rate gets really bad, especially the last level of Turok 2 on the original N64 is nearly unplayable, especially if you use the expansion pack. However, in the remastered versions of these games, that 60 frames per second really feels like you're playing what the developers were originally imagining, what they were going for with their design of the original game. The other part of Night Dive's remasters that I love is that they take careful consideration into adapting the controls to modern sensibilities. So if you just got done playing any modern first-person shooter, going back to the first-person shooters of old, it's a real learning curve to go back to that way of playing these games. However, in the remastered versions of the games control like you're playing a modern game. The other thing to note about these games is not only are they running smoother, but the graphics are so much sharper. And that can be for better or for worse. Much of those old graphics look a lot better how we remember them than when you see them up close and in high definition today. Now, while I'm holding physical copies of these games, you can download all of these remastered games right now on the Switch, on the Xbox, or on the PlayStation without ever having to get a physical disc or cartridge if that's your preferred way to play the game. In fact, all of these games were released through a boutique publisher called Limited Run Games, where they do limited pressings of each of these games, which can make them pretty expensive. If you just want to play these games the best way possible, I encourage you to look up Night Dive Studios online and see their full roster of remastered games. You might see a few other N64 classics on there as well. Star Wars games have been getting remastered left and right for modern consoles, but one N64 game did get the remaster treatment. That's Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. Star Wars Episode 1 Racer is one of those interesting games that, whether you were the cool older brother or you were the younger kid, each of you would enjoy the game just as much. The racing is fast, the gameplay is great, there's a lot of upgrades and things you can do to make the game even more customizable, the tracks are really well designed. It took the best part of the Star Wars prequels and made an incredible game out of it. Some argue that the Dreamcast version of the game is the definitive way to play Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, but I would say if you just want to play the game on your Xbox, PlayStation, or Nintendo Switch, you can download it right now at 60 frames per second and you'll have a great time. Now, while I've highlighted some of the most classic games in the N64's library, the good news is there's still a big library of N64 games you can play right now, and I'm going to highlight a few of those, and I'm still going to get to that one that I think is truly a timeless game. And spoiler, it's not Ocarina of Time. Up until Night Dive Studios, the best way to play Shadow Man was on the Dreamcast, but Night Dive Studios' version is the definitive way to play the game. This is a big action adventure game that is disturbing and dark, that follows the minds of serial killers, and you have to go do a bunch of stuff in this land called Deadside. I've played a little bit of the game, I might be butchering it by its description, but if you're curious about one of the most under the radar Nintendo 64 games ever released, this is a game that got incredible reviews when it came out. People loved and adored this game, but it just never really caught on in a major way, but it did develop quite the cult following. No pun intended. I think that Rare Replay disc is essential just for BanjoKazooie and Perfect Dark alone, but there's still a lot of other N64 games on there, some of which are a bit more in that hidden gem category, one of which is one of the most infamous games on the entire console platform. But we'll start with the hidden gems. The first is Blast Corps. Blast Corps is a game that's really hard to describe. You're dealing with like trying to stop these nuclear weapons that are about to explode by destroying things in the pathways of the vehicles, and you have different machines that you use to help make sure that this happens without destroying the world. I'm not doing this game any justice. People who have played this game love this game, but it's also one that was fairly common for the N64 and not really talked about, but it seems later in its life it's one that people really love to go back to. One of the games that I wish could be better, but just I've never been able to love, but is still worth trying out, is Jet Force Gemini. This is a game on the Nintendo 64 that is absolutely destroyed by rough controls and these little teddy bear things that you have to save called tribals. In order to beat the game, you have to rescue all of them, but they constantly run out into fire, and it makes it really frustrating to play this game. It's a huge and imaginative third-person shooter that did a lot on the N64. It's sort of amazing that this game fit on the console at all, but unfortunately, even on Rare Replay, there's just a few too many things that hold it back from greatness, but it's still absolutely worth giving a try. Perhaps the most infamous game on the Nintendo 64's entire library is Conker's Bad Fur Day, and you can play it on Rare Replay. Now, I don't have much to say about Conker's Bad Fur Day because I just don't like it that much. I don't think the writing's great. I don't think the platforming is all that novel or interesting. For whatever reason, people love it. It's a bit of a cult hit. It's about a squirrel with a potty mouth that does a lot of stuff with a potty. The physical copy of this game for the Nintendo 64 is one of the more expensive games on the console, but you can play this version of it on Rare Replay right now for far less and get 29 other games, all of which are better than Conker's Bad Fur Day. I know, shots fired. I've talked a lot about the Switch's online service, but there's a ton of games on there, a lot of which are first-party classics like Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Yoshi Story, Paper Mario, or the absolute classic Mario Kart 64 complete with online multiplayer. A few of my personal favorite Nintendo 64 games are also on the Switch's online service. Games like Wave Race 64. The mechanics and the controls of Wave Race 64 are still just as fun today as they were back then. I still love riding the jet ski out in the middle of the water and just practicing tricks. Another game that doesn't hold up quite as well today, but is still a lot of fun to go back to, is arguably one of the greatest snowboarding games ever made, and that's 1080. 1080's never been a really expensive game on the N64 on the secondhand market, and you've been able to download it on the Wii and the Wii U shops, but it's available there on the Switch's online service, and I love playing it even to this day. Gotta keep on doing the thing with the control. There's a lot of other great games on there, but there are three that I want to highlight that you may have not ever played before that I think are absolutely worth revisiting today. The first of which is a Japanese exclusive called Sin and Punishment. Sin and Punishment was a Japanese exclusive to the Nintendo 64 that never came out on any other systems. There was a sequel to this game on the Wii, but as far as the GameCube or an English version of this game, it never came. The good news is the voice acting in this is all done in English. It's sort of a mystery why it didn't come over in the first place. Now be warned, the controls take a little bit to get used to, but once you do, it's a really rewarding gameplay experience. One of my favorite racers on the N64 and also on the GameCube is Extreme G. Extreme G is a lot like the game F-Zero X. What I liked a lot about Extreme G was its personality and style. For me personally, I've enjoyed Extreme G more than I have F-Zero. There's something about the track design and the combat elements that just really worked for me. Playing it on the Switch's online service, there's something that they did to the textures that clean them up a little bit that make it a lot more fun to play for me on the Switch's online service than on the original N64. As a side note, Extreme G did get a sequel on the N64 called XG2, but it's the game after that, Extreme G3, that I think is the best in the series. Still, the original is a lot of fun. And last in terms of hidden gems was the game that we all hoped would be Metal Gear Solid for our Nintendo 64, but it ended up being a prototype of Gears of War. That's the game Winback. Playing this game on a Pro controller is a bit of a tough hang, but in terms of playing it on the original N64 controller, it's actually quite enjoyable. Maybe the best way to explain the game is that Winback walked so that Gears of War could run. It's a bit of a slower paced game. If you were to run into a room and just start going guns blazing, you would lose each level pretty quickly. Now, it may just be a personal bias because games like Rainbow Six Vegas are some of my favorite games ever, and those all use a cover mechanic where there's an over-the-shoulder perspective, but for me it really started with win-back. There are mechanics to it that are really tough to go back to. You can kind of stick to the walls, or if you get anywhere up close in proximity to people that you're in a gunfight with, the game becomes almost unplayable. But if you play the game by its rules and just go slow and methodically, it's very satisfying and a lot of fun to play even today. Just use an N64 controller, don't try and play this with a Pro controller. The N64 version of Winback did kind of get an upgraded version on the PlayStation 2, but I still love it on the N64, and the Switch's online service does a fine job with it. Now those are the main games I want to highlight. I'm definitely not going to talk about Glover because I don't like that game. But there is one game on Nintendo's online service for the Nintendo 64 that I think to this day is one of the most timeless, most amazing gameplay experiences you can have. And whether you have a Pro controller or an N64 controller, you're still gonna have an incredible experience. And that's Star Fox 64. The way that this game plays and the way that it is designed make it easily my favorite game in the entire series. Star Fox on the Super Nintendo is fun, but the frame rate is abysmal and it's really hard to get into the flow of that game. The two GameCube versions of Star Fox have their own problems, one of which is that one doesn't feel like a Star Fox game, and the other one is just not very fun to play, especially those on-foot missions. For some reason, they kept on trying to tinker with this formula. Nintendo, if you're watching, if you're listening, please consider bringing us back to this version of Star Fox. Give us a shooter that's 3D, that takes us from point A to point B, with Easter eggs that take us into multiple pathways and different levels. Give us back all range mode. Let it just focus on great shooting at 60 frames per second. Rediscovering this game on the Nintendo Switch's online service made me appreciate just how timeless a game it is, and of all the games released for the Nintendo 64, by far, this is the one that holds up as the most timeless, more than any other game that released for the console. Now, while you can play most of the very best games of the N64's library today in modern times without having to use an original console, there's still a few games that I would love to see end up on the Nintendo Switch's online service. Fingers crossed. The first game I'm gonna highlight is Body Harvest. Body Harvest is a 3D action-adventure, third-person shooter game that was developed by DMA Design, who you may know as Rockstar Games. These are the people who would go on to bring us the Grand Theft Auto series, and it started with Body Harvest. The aesthetic of the game is like a cheesy 50s sci-fi movie where giant bugs are overtaking the world, and you have to go from town to town, and you can go into any vehicle. This game's design is so ambitious, what they tried to do with the open world aspects of it, what they tried to do with the gameplay experiences of it. And yes, in the modern era, Body Harvest is really tough to go back to. This is arguably one of the very first open world type of games, but there's still a linear pathway through each level. The bugs are awesome, the fighting is awesome, but there are elements of the game that really are frustrating, like the camera controls, like the amount of fog. I would love to see Night Dive Studios take this game on with a proper remaster. But what I would love to see Night Dive Studios do is not just go and remaster the game and get us 60 frames per second and fix the controls. I'd love to see them fix the camera. I'd love to see them update the bugs a little bit, and I would love to see them update the character designs of the NPCs that right now look like they're made of like 4 polygons each. Supposedly there's a remake of this game that's in development. I hope it comes out. I would love to play it because Body Harvest is one of my favorite games on the Nintendo 64. The best racing game on the Nintendo 64 is not Diddy Kong Racing and is not Mario Kart 64. It is Beetle Adventure Racing. This is one of the most fun racing games I've ever played on any console ever. One of the things that this game really nails is the adventure aspect of Beetle Adventure Racing. Each track takes about 5 minutes to complete one lap, and there's multiple pathways through that go through a lot of really different, unique environments, and a lot of crazy stuff happens. There's UFO crash landings, there's dinosaurs that run out at you, where you feel like you're driving through Jurassic Park. Maybe the toughest thing about this game today is that some of the controls feel a little bit floaty, and that can be a little bit frustrating, but at the same time, once you get into how the game plays, it's so much fun. I highlighted Star Wars Episode 1 Racer earlier, and publisher LucasArts is responsible for some of the very best gameplay experiences on the N64. All of the Star Wars games that are on the N64 have their respective charms, some more than others. Most of us have a lot of great memories with the game Shadows of the Empire, but going back to it today is really tough with those floaty controls. However, there are 2 N64 games from LucasArts that I would love to see either get total remasters or just be brought to the Switch's online service. The first of which is Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine. I've been playing this game a lot lately and sort of discovering it for the first time, and I'm really enjoying it. It arguably has some of the best graphics and presentation on the system, which wouldn't mean anything if the game isn't fun to play, and it's a blast. If Indiana Jones is what inspired Tomb Raider, Tomb Raider's gameplay is what inspired the Infernal Machine, and it's really fun. Some of the levels are really big, and there's a lot to explore. It's more of an adventure game, less of an action game. In fact, the combat parts of the game really kind of slow it down. It's the puzzle solving and going through the different dungeons or tombs or whatever we want to call it that Indiana Jones is exploring. One's a sunken ship. There's one where you're going down a river and you go through multiple pathways. On the current N64 version of Indiana Jones right now, there's a couple of big problems that hold it back that I would love to see a remaster address. Number one is the frame rate. When there's action happening, when there's shooting happening, the frame rate totally slows down, especially when there's multiple enemies on screen. And it's my understanding that the later levels, the geometry of the levels and the graphical effects of the levels really start to slow things down in terms of that frame rate. In addition, the game was supposedly rushed through development, and so there's a lot of glitches and bugs that I'm encountering in my gameplay experience where walls will disappear or different things will pop in and out of the architecture of the scene, or there'll be snow falling indoors when it's falling outdoors, that kind of stuff. But even still, with all of that, I still love playing the game because the design of the puzzles is so great. But the game that I would love to see get remastered is Star Wars Rogue Squadron. Star Wars Rogue Squadron on the Nintendo 64 is such a great 3D shooter. It's super tough and yet super rewarding. It's just so much fun. It was basically taking the first level from Shadows of the Empire and making it an entire game out of that one level, and people loved it. Now, I'd say if you can remaster Episode 1 Racer, I would love to see some remastering go into Rogue Squadron, but I would hope that they could do a little more than what they did with Episode 1 Racer. I would fix draw distances, I would update the controls, I would make sure it runs at 60 frames per second, I would update the textures. I would really put a little bit of extra muscle into this one because the ground floor design, the base level core design of this game is so good, it's so fun. I'd love to play it again on modern systems, but I'm still okay playing it on the N64. Just really want to play it on the modern consoles in a remastered version. Snowboard Kids is Mario Kart 64 on snowboards. Each lap in Snowboard Kids is done by racing from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain and then taking your chairlift back up to the top. The courses all have a really fun, wacky design. Some of them don't even have any snow on them at all, but it's still the same idea of going from the top of the hill to the bottom. And there's even a trick system, although it's pretty shallow and it's not going to replace a game like 1080 anytime soon. This is an Atlas published game, the sequel of which is a pretty good game, but the rubber band AI in it almost kills the entire experience. The really cool thing about this game is that it's really well done. It runs smoothly. There's not really major frame rate issues that hold it back. It's just a good playing, fun experience, and online multiplayer mode would be a total plus. The last game I would love to see come to the Switch's online service or get a remaster is Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. It's a 3D platformer with some really unique characters and just a lot of elements to it that are so wacky and weird, but is very much who the Mystical Ninja character and universe is. There is a sequel to this game that abandons the 3D approach and does a side-scrolling approach called Goemon's Great Adventure, but I just really liked this game. The big robot battles, the levels were a lot of fun to explore. It's not nearly as tight or as well designed as, say, Super Mario 64 or BanjoKazooie, but as far as playing it again in the modern era, I'd love to revisit this one in the Switch's online service or with a total remaster. And this game's published by Konami, and they've done these compilations with Contra and Castlevania. I mean, how about a Mystical Ninja Goemon compilation? We can dream, right? Now you may be saying to yourself, Mort, I don't care. I want to collect physical copies of games. I want to play them on my modern television. What's the best way to do that? Well, there are different things you can do to plug in directly to your console that give you an HDMI output. They have mixed reviews on different ones that you use. Make sure you do a little bit of research. But the big news is that this year there's a system coming out called the Analog 3D, which is an N64 console that is made to be played on modern televisions. It's not a Nintendo console. There's no reviews on it. There's no published information about it other than it's been pre-ordered by me and a bunch of other N64 enthusiasts based on the strength of the company Analog and their previous output of consoles. I'm cautiously optimistic about the Analog 3D. I'm really curious about what's going to happen, but I'm also a little bit sort of, hey, we haven't seen any gameplay footage, but I also understand there may be licensing or copyright issues that forbid them from advertising it. I like the sweater. It's a little big, but I like it. I'm not pregnant. Promise. There are 296 games in the Nintendo 64's console library. Not nearly enough time in this video to go through all of the ones that I would also love to see on the Switch's online service or to get a remaster, but you tell me, let me know in the comments below your personal favorites, what you would love to see go to the Switch's online service or get a remaster or get remade entirely. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you on the next one.